Two quick slides on an introduction or a reminder on Vista and who we are for some of our customers that might be new to us or customers that have not done any business with us. We've been in business for 34 years. We've seen the ups and downs. Currently, we're in a bit of a strange position with kind of technology and the economy. We're still servicing customers and doing what we can to help out. We've shipped a lot of orders to a lot of different customers. So again, we've seen a lot of stuff over the years. And with that, we have, with all of those different solutions and conversations that we've had with customers over the years, we've got a lot of different offerings. We find a lot of times even our current customers might not understand all of the things that we can do. So we categorize our offerings in data center, supply chain, and technology services. So today we'll be talking about some new features and items around vSphere 7. And that kind of solely, or that kind of squarely sits in both data center and technology services. So the data center component of it, the software, the licensing, but we do also have services for architecture, pre-sales, delivery, ongoing management and managed services for your VMware environment. So with that, I am going to hand it off to John.
Awesome, thanks Rob. So just a quick introduction. So my name is John Heckert. I'm a distribution sales engineer with VMware. And today we're doing a quick update on what vSphere 7 is bringing to the table for our valued customers. So the first thing that I want to take a look at is actually where the VMware portfolio sits today. A lot of customers still think that VMware is just a server virtualization company that produces a pretty good hypervisor. When really across the board, if you've heard our value pitch over the last couple years, I call it the any strategy. So we say any app on any cloud, any infrastructure, deploying to any device. So if we look at up and down kind of the portfolio slide I'm sitting on, everything from back end for the software-defined data center and everything ready to go on and move on to the hybrid cloud. We have a lot of agreements with our public cloud providers like AWS, IBM, Azure, and all the way to actually delivering applications to actual end users with Workspace ONE, federating access management with identity management in your existing investments. So across the board, VMware essentially has a solution that can play and add value to essentially any area of your data center. And just a quick look of the actual products that align to some of these kind of key strategies that we're pushing out that you might be adopting as users. We have solutions that fit into each one of these areas. Virtual cloud networking for advanced network functionality, network virtualization with NSX, and SD-WAN with our VeloCloud acquisition. Give or take 2.5 years ago, I think we acquired VeloCloud, and that pushes out our SD-WAN solution. Everything to digital workspace with Workspace ONE. And honestly, our most recent acquisition, actually increasing our security portfolio, is our Carbon Black. So that is now a VMware company, and now part of our portfolio with actually securing the infrastructure from end to end with some of the stuff we have built into the platform, which we'll talk about, and then some of the things that Carbon Black brings with endpoint protection. So before we jump into vSphere 7, let's recap where vSphere 6 left off, specifically with 6.7 and a couple of the updates. A couple of the things we focused on within 6.7 were simple and efficient management, built-in security, and a universal app platform. So we wanted to create a platform that is consistent across the board, easily manageable with some of the advancements that we made, and easily move things between clouds, between your on-prem and then your cloud services, regardless of where you're hosting those cloud resources. So within the first update of vSphere 6.7, update 1, we transitioned to a fully HTML5 based vSphere client. This was more of a cosmetic upgrade, as the old Flash one, honestly, after a while looked pretty dated. It looked like old technology. So all of VMware's platform moving forward will all be based on the HTML5 GUI. We added a couple of things in here to talk about specific features. The vCenter Server Converge tool. We moved from a traditional architecture of vCenter and then your platform services controller. We moved into a single vCenter server appliance to manage an environment. That's that simple management. but some customers coming off of the old architecture where they were split, this tool actually does that and helps you combine those two sources into the appliance and helps you transition seamlessly to that new platform. vMotion capabilities for GPUs. If you guys are using GPUs for VDI workloads, for CAD workloads, or for any kind of application workload, 6.7 gave the capability to vMotion, where if before that, if you ever wanted to move a workload around that was using a GPU, you had to completely suspend that application or that virtual machine. And we gave the vMotion capability to GPU-enabled virtual machines and workloads. And then content library, having a single consistent place for your content library to manage a single spot instead of managing multiple vCenters. With update 2, we continued to advance some of the things within the convergence tool, gave it a good user interface for moving on to that new vCenter server appliance. 2 of the bigger things that happened in update 2 are up on the screen. We implemented a VMware solution called VMware App Defense. So that is a security solution meant to look at known good state of virtual machines. Just a real quick explanation. You take a workload, you want to run it in production, you actually can have App Defense watch that workload run, you give it a known good state, App Defense learns the recipe of that virtual machine running. Once you put it out in production, it will continue to monitor that virtual machine. And if anything happens outside of its known good recipe, say for instance, somebody opens up a new port or a new communication path to that VM that was not told to App Defense will stop it, will suspend it, will let an admin know, hey, somebody's trying to transfer files to this new domain. You might want to come take a look at it. This isn't part of the recipe. And that's a new security portion of the portfolio within VMware. And we increased the VM maximum configurable sizes to 256 vCPUs and 6 terabytes of RAM. That's for our large, very large application workloads like SAP HANA, like Oracle database workloads. And specific to that feature in update 2, we have a new vMotion enhancement in vSphere 7 that aligns to that new VM maximum. There was an additional update within vSphere 6.7 update 3. There was nothing really major within that update. So we don't have a slide specific, some new driver enhancements. One of the things that is starting to be deprecated within VM is the VMK Linux drivers. So there was actually 2 sets of drivers within VMware. There were Linux drivers for some third-party insertion and drivers, and then there were the native VM drivers. We are fully transitioning over to the native drivers, and we actually have a patching tool or a command line tool to run a command to see if any of your platform is using the old Linux drivers before transitioning to vSphere 7. Just wanted to make you guys aware of that. So as we look at what was happening in 6.7 before transitioning into vSphere 7, we noticed kind of what direction VMware was headed with some of the enhancements we were making to the platform. And now we get to the new modern platform that is vSphere 7. So before I talk about some of the specific enhancements within the platform, let's talk about the direction that vSphere 7, that VMware is taking that platform. And really, our whole direction is containers are the future. Couple of quick salesy stats. I'm not a huge fan of some of these, but 64% growth through 2022 of container adoption within the market, and by 2022, 77% of organizations will deploy containers primarily in the data center. So containers are continuing to be adopted. What we have seen in VMware generally is like a history of VMware is we kind of make some advancements for very top end customers, like the top 5, top 20% of using technology, and slowly but surely those features will trickle down to even the smallest of end customers. We have seen that. I mean, even if you look at the history of vSphere virtualization, of server virtualization, even 10 years ago, a lot of customers say, you know, I'm too small to use server virtualization. I don't really see a lot of benefit of it. And generally now, just about everybody is doing server virtualization in some way, shape, or form, whether that's VMware, Citrix, any other competitor. Server virtualization has trickled down to the entire IT base. And I think containers are kind of that same direction where top 20% are using it. VMware has positioned their platform to adopt containers very well, and will continue to trickle down and make sense for more customers moving forward. Just as a quick side note from a history standpoint, if anybody wants an example of an everyday company, maybe not an everyday company, but a large company using containers on a consistent basis is Netflix. If you watch or stream anything on Netflix, when you go to start that stream, essentially a container is instantly deployed with that application and that service running to run that stream. And when you exit out of that stream just to get back to the main Netflix screen, the container is blown up. So there is no lifecycle management. It's completely destroyed. And then when you start the next stream, it pops up another container to host that service. So that's just an example. And we will continue to see that containerization trickle down to more end users as we move on. So what is an application? Really talking about what a lot of people think an application is and what an application actually is today. And the previous example is really just a couple of VMs, maybe a web front end, maybe a database, and maybe a user base to access the application. And that's really what consisted of an application. We really think of it as this very simple thing, a couple of services running. When really today, modern applications are continuing to advance sprawl, continuing to advance the complexity of those applications, and continuing to create a use case for containerization. So we're going to take a lot of these application services, application workloads, and continue to put them into a container because it's easier to manage, it's easier to develop on top of, and it's easier to deploy those containers and those services. So if we notice, we have some app with some GPU acceleration, a couple of database app, and maybe a Kubernetes cluster with some microservices running in there to really create that full-fledged application running in our data center. So with this new way modern apps are developed, we are now going to talk about vSphere 7 and Cloud Foundation services. We're not going to spend a ton of time here. It gets rather deep into some of the functionality, but at a high level, when we look at development and production, a lot of times we have developers developing on lab and test and dev clusters, and then we have production running a different environment. So these two silos have always been separated. So when the engineers develop a new application, a new service, they go to production, say, okay, run this application, but the two environments were distinctly separate. They were running completely different versions of vSphere, maybe different versions of Windows, different C++ libraries for coding, any other language compiler, really turns into this conversation of, okay, now we need to take that application you created and refinagle it so it'll run in our production environment. When really containerization pulls all of those dependencies into the actual service. So if we create a platform where I can run my production and create containers that let my developers and engineers develop these applications, it really creates this cohesive environment where the infrastructure, the operators, the IT admins, and the developers are kind of all on the same level, as opposed to having two competing philosophies, if you will. So when we look at Cloud Foundation, which is just Cloud Foundation is a product from VMware that includes vSphere, vSAN for storage, NSX for networking, all kind of wrapped together with something we call SDDC, or Software Defined Data Center Manager. You will get these different services running in the same platform. So you will get the infrastructure services of vSphere that we all know and love, and you also get these Tanzu runtime services. We heard some updates with vSphere 7 back in VMworld in 2019 that Kubernetes and containerization were getting built into the platform. Well, that platform built in and those functionalities are all encompassed in that Tanzu runtime service for deploying and getting vSphere essentially enabled at the heart of the platform for containerization. And Cloud Foundation is how you adopt that strategy and how you adopt that functionality. So the next section I got is to the actual feature upgrades around vSphere 7. We'll spend a little bit more time than I did on some of the containerization, but I want to pause there and ask Rob if we have any questions in the Q&A or anything popped up before I move on to the next section.
We've had a few pop up that I've been able to answer, so we are good to continue.
Awesome. And please continue to keep the questions I love questions. Even if I don't have the answer, it causes me to do more research and learn more. So please, any questions you have, feel free to throw them in there, and we'll do our best to get you guys an answer. So for everybody looking at vSphere 7, maybe you're a current vSphere 6.5 customer, 6.7 customer, looking at vSphere 7, what upgrading to vSphere 7, going through all that hassle and whatnot, what will that offer to me, and what functionality am I going to get when I update to vSphere 7? So these updates will encompass 3 key areas: simplified lifecycle management, some intrinsic security that we're going to talk about, continuing the security conversation, because to be honest, if you're an end user and security is not a part of your strategy moving forward, that's not a great strategy. Security needs to be top of mind, essentially when any new project is coming down. How is security going to be folded in, and what's the strategy there? And then talk about some of the application acceleration things we put into to increase the functionality and performance of our applications. So the first one is simplified lifecycle management. If we've ever gone through a vSphere update, whether that's drivers, PCIe cards, network cards, the actual hosts, the VMs, it's a process. You know, we usually have to dedicate some engineering time over the course of a week, a couple weeks, to kind of update an entire environment from a vSphere standpoint. With the new lifecycle manager starting in 7, we can actually do something called desired state. And we kind of bring in some automation into that. So essentially desired state, just like how I talked about in app defense, where it's known good state and it checks against it, we can actually set a desired state in Lifecycle Manager saying, I want my entire cluster to be on vSphere 6.7. Say I'm upgrading from 6.5 to 6.7. And it would actually look at and check all of the hardware functionalities. It would check all of the hardware against the HCL. It would let you know, hey, this is good to go. This is good to go. We're going to start moving this forward. And it would do it in steps along the way. We really want to remove the human interaction as much as possible, because as we know, the mother of all security flaws is human intervention and fat fingering, right? So a lot of times security solutions are amazing and they do exactly what they do. And most of the time when there's some kind of breach, it's because of a misconfiguration. So if we can automate a lot of these things to plan and move forward with updates to our environment, that's where this simplified lifecycle manager comes into play. Now, again, I know I gave an example of like 6.5 to 6.7, but you cannot take advantage of the lifecycle manager until you're in 7. And then moving forward, it will continue to add value to your environment as new updates come out, maybe update 1, then 7.1 or 7.3 comes out. Actually, sometimes it's rather funny how they decide the numbers. I don't know why it went from 6.0 to 6.5 and then to 6.7. Why wouldn't you go to like 6.1, 6.2? You know, it's something that's probably a little above my pay grade. But yeah, so to help you moving forward from 7 moving on, simplified lifecycle management, automation, desired state, all of that will be included in the vSphere 7 update. Moving on to intrinsic security. One of the things I may not have mentioned during the 6.7 kind of recap was one of the things we had was trusted platform module. So we can actually have secure recipes for booting within the actual ESXi host or the actual virtual machine. So secure boot meaning it will check the boot order against like an encrypted recipe for how the machine should boot. So a lot of malware, a lot of viruses, a lot of hacks require something be installed in the bootloader to be able to run. And that's how we can check against some of those new age hacks. This new trust authority is essentially we can take a couple of very trusted hosts with clean install with vSphere 7, 7.1, and whatever the new updates will be. Maybe even if it's an air-gapped server with no network connectivity, can't be hacked anyway because there's no network cables running to it, except for connected to the cluster. And we can have a clean install, and then we can continually check all of the hosts running in production against that trusted host that I say this is good to go, it's 100% check against, and it will let you know, hey, this host has something running that my trusted host does not have running. Let's take a look at it. So this helps you detect tampering, virus installs, modifications, and it helps you keep a kind of like a running check against your environment for future security flaws and breaches. In the same line with security, we've actually brought in identity federation into vCenter server access. So if you are, maybe you're already a Workspace ONE customer using identity federation, using RSA, Okta, Duo for multi-factor authentication and to ensure identity, we have brought a lot of those tools and those authentication methods into vCenter server to make it easier and more secure to actually access your vCenter for your vCenter server admins to get it in. So a lot of those fancy security tools for ensuring identity for Workspace ONE, we have folded it into our vCenter server access to kind of increase the security for logging into our vCenter server. Couple of enhancements for application performance. We're going to talk, we have a couple specific slides, but here's kind of a quick rundown. So GPU virtualization, we talked about being able to vMotion with a GPU back in 6.7, and I'll talk about some of the additional features we have added into GPU virtualization for what we call assignable hardware and dynamic direct path IO. We'll talk about DRS and how we moved from a host base to a VM base. And then we talk about the improved vMotion. We talked about that 6.7 update, the 256 CPUs and 6 terabytes of memory, and how we can increase the performance of those VMs by reducing the amount of disruption with a vMotion move. And then we'll talk a little bit about persistent memory, or what we call PMEM. So first, let's talk about enhanced vMotion. As we continue to see these applications workloads increase in size and increase in complexity, we continue to see a lag time and how big that VM is to move it over to a new host. So a lot of things have to happen. We have to stop a lot of services, restart them on the other side. A lot of memory files need to be kind of cataloged and then moved over to a new host. Previously, I don't want to really get into the tech of it. It's something I've been kind of reading up a lot about in the last couple weeks. It involves a lot of these page files that we store into memory and stopping CPUs across the board, taking a catalog and then moving them over, which will caused a lot of stun time because we had to wait for all of the memory files to move over. We have decreased the stun time in that stoppage by changing how we address those memory files. So instead of stopping all of them at once and moving it over, we actually stop one CPU cycle at a time, move those files over, and it's actually a more efficient process for moving over to decrease that stun time for those larger workloads. Again, more of those larger ones like Oracle and SAP HANA. And improved DRS. This is actually a rather big one. What we've consistently seen from distributed resource scheduler, or what we call it, what essentially is our built-in load balancer, is we've always looked at the cluster level. We've always looked at the health of the hosts across the cluster to determine if my workloads are balanced. And really, when you really think about it, what do you care about the most? You actually care about how your VMs are performing, not how your hosts are performing. We want the host to perform well, but essentially I want my VMs to be the number one thing measured against when looking at performance and optimization of my cluster. So instead of taking a host approach to DRS, we actually take a workload-centric or VM approach to DRS, or for distributed resource scheduler. That means if you look at this little screenshot here in the top here, it says VM DRS score, and it has it in blocks of 20%. So 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, et cetera, et cetera. So we actually take a look at a couple of metrics, or a bunch of metrics within the VM: CPU available time, percent CPU good actions, lag time between actions and CPU, and we essentially produce a DRS score. So we will continue to balance the cluster to make sure our VMs are getting the best possible scores throughout the entire cluster. So regardless if it looks like a host is unbalanced because maybe more VMs are available on a different host, or maybe one host is underutilized, but we're more focused on the VMs getting the best possible, or we call it a happy. We always throw quotes around. It's the happy score of the VM. Now, one of the other changes, just real deep into the nitty gritty, when we did old DRS based on host, that was in every 5 minutes, it would scan the cluster and make decisions. And with the new one, we actually scan it every 60 seconds. We scan the cluster to make changes. So we increase the amount of time it actually takes or we actually decrease the amount of time we take scanning the cluster to make sure we're balanced depending on your own rules, and then what we decide is the DRS score. And here's the fun one. Let's talk about assignable hardware with GPUs. So when we go and assign a GPU, let's talk about one of the ways I found that I learned better is I need to learn the old way that they did it and why the new way is better. Right? So let's look at the old way. Before, in the old way, we would take a virtual machine and we would assign a GPU to that virtual machine. Now, even before that 6.7 update around vMotion, if I wanted to move that VM, I had to decouple that GPU and then vMotion, right? Or I had to either stop and suspend and move, or I had to decouple the GPU and move it over to make that vMotion happen. With the vMotion update, I can now vMotion that virtual machine. The GPU might not be there, but the VM will continue to run. Maybe some of the advanced stuff we do with the GPU is just on pause for a minute before we move it back. Now with dynamic direct path IO and some of the things we're doing with assignable hardware, that means I can actually, instead of assigning a GPU to a virtual machine, I assign an attribute of that GPU. So think it just the way we correlate server virtualization, where that VM is not actually using the server CPU. CPU is given to the hypervisor, and the hypervisor splits it up and gives it to the virtual machine. With assignable hardware, instead of assigning the GPU to the VM, I assign an attribute or a function of that GPU to the virtual machine. Now with assignable hardware, if I want to move that VM over to another host with vMotion or with DRS, because now it is fully folded into the new DRS, I don't need to find the exact same GPU on another host. I just need to find another GPU with that same attribute that it can consume that resource from. So that is the difference between the old way that we did GPUs, where you sign the whole GPU, and unless you had the exact same GPU on another host, it couldn't do the vMotion or be balanced. Now we actually, what we call is, what's the word I'm looking for? Abstract. We abstract the functionality of that GPU, sign it to the virtual machine, then we can move that virtual to another host with a completely different GPU. But as long as it has that functionality on that GPU or that attribute, we can absolutely just vMotion it over and live migrate it. That's something that was not capable before. So the last thing we'll talk about is persistent memory, or PMEM. I don't have a slide specific on it in the deck, so I do apologize. But essentially the advancements in memory technology and storage technology, if we want to have the absolute best possible performance for a virtual machine, and a lot of that relies on CPU memory and storage. So what we can do is this thing called persistent memory. We essentially can now install a hard drive into a memory slot on a motherboard. So we get all of the performance of memory with none of the volatility. So it's a little bit decrease in performance. It's not as fast as memory, but it's much faster than storage. We can actually put a hard drive into a memory slot and assign that to a virtual machine, and they have the fastest possible storage capable within a server. Now that requires specific hardware. Intel has a lot of PMEM enabled, ready to go hardware devices. But essentially, if you're looking for increased performance, we talked about a lot of the application performance updates in vSphere 7. PMEM is something you guys should absolutely look at, or persistent memory to look at to increase that performance, to have that better experience with your virtual machine. And we can obviously talk more about that if questions come up. So a couple of quick portfolio updates. Within 6.7, 6.5, I showed you guys App Defense. We talked a little bit about what App Defense does from a security standpoint. We actually had a suite of solutions called Platinum that were a combination of vSphere Enterprise Plus and App Defense into a single solution. And to be honest, it was the only time in VMware's portfolio where if you bought it bundled together, you got an extra integration into vCenter Server that you did not get if you bought it a la carte. It actually was not in line with how anything else we do in our portfolio. There's no missing integration if you buy things a la carte. So as of April of this year, so month and a half or month some change ago, we actually changed to no longer vSphere Platinum or vCloud Foundation Platinum is available. You simply just buy vSphere Enterprise Plus or vSphere Standard. I think it does all work all the way down to Essentials Plus as well. And then you just buy App Defense as a standalone product, and you will get that same integration available to you that you did if you bought it in Platinum. So the last thing here before I move on to the next slide is if anybody already has vSphere Platinum, if you're already using it, it will continue to be supported. I believe the support is running through, I don't think it's listed here, but it might be like 2022, like mid 2022. It will continue to be supported. And even when Platinum, quote unquote, because it's just a soft bundle, even when it's not supported, it's in your licensing in your My VMware, it'll just split into two different products. So you'll still continue to do upgrades and renew subscription and support, but instead of renewing Platinum, you're going to renew vSphere, whatever vSphere on, and then renew App Defense by itself. So it'll just change it up how a little bit, but it will continue to be supported. And the last portfolio update I have is around the CPU core licensing model. So anybody who's licensed vSphere over the past 4 or 5 years, if you're some of the old guard, I remember when I first started in the industry, VMware was still on a memory cycle where every CPU license actually had a memory total tied to it. So like say for instance, standard had 32 gigs of memory. If you wanted to run standard with 64, you actually had to put 2 licenses in there. But as we continue to add cores to the die with Intel and with AMD, we are continuing to see customers move towards more a single CPU, more core model for running their applications and their server virtualization. So in line with how every other software vendor is starting to change it up, we are now putting a core limit onto single CPU licenses. Your single CPU licenses will cover any CPU up to 32 physical cores. So if we look at the chart off to the right, if I have one CPU with 28 cores, before it was one CPU license, and even after the announcements, it's still one CPU license. However, now I have one CPU at 48 cores. Before it was just one license, and moving forward, you will actually need 2 CPU licenses to cover those 48 cores because it's more than 32, but under 64. So if you kind of just do some of the math, you can guess how many CPU licenses each socket will need to cover. So that is moving forward. Generally, if we're all on an Intel install base, you will really not need to worry about it because I think Intel's largest processor right now is 24 or 28 cores. It's really if you're an AMD customer looking to more adoption of these larger core CPUs, this is just something you're gonna have to think about moving forward with your vSphere licensing. So that is what I have from a high level overview of what VMware is bringing to the table in vSphere 7. Again, a lot of those features and functionality you won't be able to take advantage of until you're in 7. So for instance, like that simplified lifecycle manager. I know I said 6.5, so I just want to make sure there's no confusion. Won't be able to adopt that until you're in 7 and then moving forward from 7 when the next release comes out. I am here for any questions. I think we got one more slide and then Rob's going to chime back in here on the next slide. But I will stay on the line and try and answer any questions that come up, or obviously do follow up for any questions that happen after the call as well.
So where do we go next? Anytime there's a next release, from our customers, we get usually the same questions. And what we're trying to do is get ahead of some of those questions for our customers. So what can we do? We can do anything from managing and co-terming renewals. So don't let those renewals sneak up on you. We've got a tool that helps track those. We can also co-term if you would like, so that you don't have to worry about 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, however many renewals that you have going throughout the year. We can take a look at an install base report for you to understand what you actually have, what might make sense renewing, what you might be able to sunset. There are also 2 assessments that we can offer. The optimization assessment. We have the ability to take a look at an existing environment and maybe understand changing the sizes on virtual machines from a memory CPU perspective, get a little more density without sacrificing performance. We also have the ability to do an upgrade assessment. So a lot of our customers end up having hardware that is maybe 1 or 2 generations behind. And will this be supported with vSphere 7? We have the ability to run a tool to perform an assessment on that infrastructure to understand what you can use, what you might not be able to use, and an upgrade path for you. And really, for the most part, these first 4 services that we can offer come to our customers at no cost, depending on what you really need. And if we do need to dive into the weeds on an optimization assessment or an upgrade assessment, there might be some chargeable services in there. But for the most part, those do come at no cost. And lastly, if you do need help with our engineering staff to actually perform the upgrade, we can help either come through and scope and do some pure consulting and make recommendations on how to do the upgrade and the steps, and give you access into some labs and things like that. Or we can also come in and do the upgrade for you during the evening, on a weekend, so that the next day you can come in and your environment is up to date.